Right, joining me on the line now is Steve Hackett, the former guitarist for the band Genesis. Steve, we really appreciate you joining us. First things first, how are you?
Yeah, very well, Henry. How are you?
Good, thank you. Now, of course, we're here to talk about your 26th studio album, At the Edge of Light. I've been lucky enough to listen to a fair few tracks on the album so far. It's absolutely fantastic. Where did the motivation to write this come from? Because it only seems like the other day that you had the night siren out.
Yeah, it's pretty close, hard on the heels, isn't it? I aim for an album a year. It doesn't always work out because when you're doing a lot of shows, it's not always possible to have those blocks of time. You know, it's nice to have a couple of months in one go where you get on with it and you crack on with as much as possible. But then the breaks are useful because you can think about things and come back to them and think about, remixing them, framing them, what it needs. So I don't usually get it all in one go. It's not chronological. I've got to live with a certain amount of panic and then address the things that make me panic. And think, I've got to fix that, rescue package, and then eventually you get something, if you're lucky, that you think is polished enough to release.
It's interesting you said about kind of having a theme and writing it on that, because I wondered whether you'd had kind of some of the tracks for At the Edge of Light for the past few years and maybe you were kind of waiting for an overall theme for that album. So when you kind of had the Night Siren, was there literally no preparation for this, or did you have obviously a few ideas about the tracks, but did you have kind of none of them firmly in the pipeline?
I had none of them at that time. I tend to run out of ideas as I do an album, and then the Japanese normally say, can we have a couple of bonus tracks? And I try to deliver bonus tracks, a whole track in a day. That's what I tend to do. And that's a pretty tall order, but I've found that the guys that I work with who do that, it's usually with Ben Fenner, who makes his live sound with us. So it's Roger King does the rest, but I put him under enormous strain, but I've found that he tends to come up with his best work, Ben, when I say, yep, whatever we do today, that's going to be the track. And it's an extraordinary thing whenever I've done that, even with a songwriting team. I remember one day, back in the days of Defector, you might think that that's a substandard album, because I came in one day and we were doing so much touring and said, no, we've got to write 3 tracks today. And by the end of the second day, we had 3 tracks written, complete with lyrics. We didn't do them all in one day, but that's extreme writing. That's but some things, of course, I spent ages and ages on. But there are times when you're under the gun and you've just got to get on and do it. So one of the tracks, which is called Descent, I did that in a day, and but I thought it was so good. I thought, no, this can't be a bonus track. This has got to go on the album. And then the idea came up of doing something which followed that, because it didn't really have an ending. And I thought, to end an album on a doomy note like that is not quite the way. So we went from Descent to Conflict, which was all-out war, and Peace, which involved love and all sorts of stuff. Age-old concepts, love and peace.
Yeah.
And resolve and, the idea of spiritual stuff, spiritual beings living in physical bodies, and various other things. Yeah, highly creative. I won't use the word pretentious, because I know a lot of people like to sort of get that in before the critics do. But no, I do actually believe that we're spirits in physical bodies, and I do believe that we live on. I'm not religious, but I'm certainly open to reading all the literature that's out there, whether that's philosophers or gurus or messiahs and saints and all the rest. But I'm not dogmatic about this stuff. I don't have a shrine that I worship at every day, other than honouring the great good music.
I think that leads me on nicely to discuss one of the tracks of the album, Under the Eye, because that seems like a fairly dark track. And I know when you've spoken about it so far, you've kind of mentioned kind of dangerous times, divisions, things like that when discussing the song. Did you intend for it to be a kind of dark song for the album, or just to highlight these divisions? What were you kind of going for with that?
I think some tracks on the album highlight divisions with the rise of the right and the worry that the demonization of the foreigner, whereas I feel we've got technology that enables us to work together all over the world. I mean, this album is a construct from the four corners of the earth. There is a core band, there's a British band, but we supplement with people from Sweden, Azerbaijan, India, just to name a few, Iceland, the United States, UK, lots of stuff. So it's an international team, and I'm very keen to preserve the freedoms that we currently have as Brits. You know, we know that it's a time of great division at the moment, but we currently have the right to live and work in 27 different countries at the drop of a hat. You don't need a visa. Also, why we would cut ourselves off and become islanders and threaten the supply chains that feed health services and food, and we get our trains from Germany and all the rest. So I think I was trying to come up with an album that reflected that, the conflict that was going on. But I think that track, Under the Eye of the Sun, really is a kind of celebration of nature's monuments. And you might be standing somewhere in the desert in Australia or the desert in Monument Valley or Sedona in the United States, and you would think that you're in the same place. It's still those same red rocks. And I've recently been to Petra and seen the same thing, the magnificent structures that look like they're from the sets of Indiana Jones and Lawrence of Arabia. I stood right next to these places where Lawrence lived and stayed with the Bedouins and all of that. But I suppose the subtext of everything is that we just back from a trip from Ethiopia and visiting the tribes and meeting different tribes, different languages, different customs. But at the end of the day, everyone seems to manage to say thank you in their language, and that point of communication is invaluable, it seems to me. So yes, it's a sort of non-demonizing the foreigner type album, if such a thing is possible. On record, I want a brotherhood of man. I mean, I know this is an old concept, but fellowship and friendship and all of that. I think it's terribly important to realize if we all work together, we can, we can get rid of famine, cancer, all the rest. But we've got to work together. If we work in isolation, people used to laugh at Russian cars. Is that what we're going to do? Things are just going to break down. It's a very highly specialized, interdependent world, and we can't afford to be without the best. We need the very best.
And Steve, the other track that's been released, the other single is Underground Railroad. Now, this is kind of along a different theme, and it seems to have
slavery.
Pretty large American influence. And I know there's a pretty important collaboration in this with Laura and Durga McBroom, who both have the kind of Pink Floyd influence, don't they? Both sang with Pink Floyd. Could you tell us a little bit about that and the American influence in that?
Sure. Well, when I was in Delaware, Wilmington, Delaware in the United States, touring a couple of years ago, we were walking by the riverside and we saw Harriet Tubman, the name. And she was a slave who escaped, who was involved with a thing called the Underground Railroad, which was a network to enable slaves to escape. And then 2 years later, I read a book by Colson Whitehead called Underground Railroad. It was recommended by Barack Obama. And that took the idea of turning it into a literal underground railroad, which didn't happen. But as a fiction, it's a great device for getting people about, and it's a great book. And I was talking to Lorelei and Durga about it on the day we were recording because they didn't know the story. They were completely in the dark as regards this, and I said, well, this is the idea. I'm after something that's a gospel feel, so it's the set lines, but you can deviate away from them, and ad-libs are welcome. So we turned those two into a whole gospel choir's worth, and I joined in myself and all of that. And then we've got another girl on it, Amanda Lehman, who sounds wonderful. And so we've got three girls on it, and I guess it's pure Americana. It starts off with harmonica, dobro. We've got the gospel feel. Then it becomes a train song. And we go through different harmonies, different choirs, and it keeps changing gear. But in a way, it's a kind of soundtrack to an imaginary movie.
There really is a unique sound to that. If you are thinking of, obviously, please do buy the album and make sure you listen to that song Underground Railroad, because I think, Steve, that is honestly, it really is something else. It's fantastic.
I'm glad you like it. All of these songs were big risks, really. It might not have come off, but I think, taking the risk it's worth doing that rather than working with, too many certainties. And so I hope that I try to avoid cliches.
Yeah, well, Steve, I was going to ask you about that, actually, because, of course, your solo career kind of begun in the 70s, the same period when you were in Genesis.
Yeah.
Would you say that your style has changed? And in particular, you did mention it then, but would you say as we kind of approach, obviously 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, you've taken more risks?
I think so, yeah. As time has gone on, I think when you're young, you might be thinking about your instrument to the exclusion of everything else. I just used to hear the guitar and tiresome songs till we got to the guitar solo. That's me. I'm sure drummers would have been the same. Listen to that bass drum. But then gradually you start to broaden, perhaps despite yourself. And I think travel broadens the mind, and it eradicates prejudice, and you come to realize what a fantastic thing that a man from Azerbaijan who's the world's greatest virtuoso on this little thing called the tar, related to the guitar, and of course the sitar, and we've got a lady on the album called Shima Mukherjee, who's incredible virtuoso on the sitar. So it's what they bring to it. So I give them space, and I think that it's a bit like if you took the idea of film directors, they've got to really they've got to think about everyone, every act, every scene, the lighting, and all the rest. So, but you can only do that if you step back. You can't always be in the limelight. You've got to be behind the camera, and you've got to be behind the controls to some extent, and just let other people shine. So, the more albums I do, the more I'm prepared to sit back and maybe let the orchestra take it. Or there's no point trying to be a hero on every track. That wouldn't produce this kind of album.
Steve, just final couple of things very quickly while we got you on the line. 2019, obviously, Now the Edge of Light isn't the only reason why you're busy. You're also going back out on tour with, of course, the old album Selling England by the Pound, an absolute classic. You're coming to the Apollo in Hammersmith, which is fairly near us, on the 29th of November. What can fans expect? Is there going to be some new stuff mixed in there? And what can people expect from that tour?
Well, the idea is to do Selling England by the Pound in its entirety. There's one reason for that. John Lennon said that Genesis was one of the bands he was listening to when we did that album, 1973. I know it's a long time ago, but whenever I hear the Beatles, it's always these were our older brothers who pointed the way and brought the whole world together. As soon as they invited in India, that was hugely important. Everyone became mainstream. So I think what we did on the coattails of the Beatles was, to my mind, the best Genesis album, Selling England by the Pound. So I'm doing that in its entirety, plus a track that was written at the same time, didn't go on the album, as a kind of included, deleted scene, and then one of my favourite solo efforts, which is Spectral Mornings. I'll be doing most of that, and then highlights from the latest album, At the Edge of Light, which we've been talking about. So all three of those albums are addressed. The first one completely in its entirety. So looking forward to doing that. Lovely to be back at Hammersmith, whatever it's called these days. The Odeon to some of us, the Apollo to others, the Inventim, whatever. And by the time I'm playing it, it'll probably have another title, but there you go.
Fantastic. Well, Steve Hackett, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Hi there, this is Steve Hackett. You're listening to Kingston Green Radio.